Hi, I'm Dulcie and I'm going to be chatting a little bit today about accessibility. So I guess when it comes down to tech, the biggest question is what is accessibility in the world of tech and why do we care? So accessibility in tech is all about, as it sounds, making things accessible. But where in the real world you might have, a wheelchair ramp for people to get onto a bus, or one of those spinning things underneath a traffic light so that people who are visually impaired can tell when they can cross. It's kind of the same thing in tech. It's all about giving cues that your sort of normal's not the right word, but sort of your default, the vast majority of your users might not notice, but at the same time making it so that people who perhaps have visual impairments or colour perception issues, cognition issues, all kinds of other things, so that they're even motor issues in terms of like typing and tapping and touching things and clicking the right area of the screen, so that people can use your site or whatever else it might be without encountering repeated difficulties with using these things. And one thing that's probably interesting to talk about is how many of these problems there actually are. Lots of people, because most of us use websites very visually and we use them very naturally, we don't really think that much about what goes into a website that might be an issue for somebody with some kind of accessibility problem. But really, if you think about it, 90% of what we do is about touching tiny little areas of screens and taking in a whole lot of visual content. So if somebody is visually impaired or might have a problem with processing what they're seeing on a screen in a logical order or something like that, it can really be a problem to sort of unpack all the information that's shown in videos and images and through a lot of colours and icons and signals like that, and to make sense of those in a way that you might not realise if you just use it as a normal thing. For instance, a good example of this is colourblindness. So, for instance, my brother has quite severe colourblindness, and it means that he really struggles to distinguish between pinks and oranges and reds, and also with dark greens and blues and purples and blacks and greys. He just cannot tell a difference. And that might not sound like a big deal, but when you're looking at things like warning buttons that are bright red, buttons that are meant to show that there's something dangerous or bad, it might be very hard for somebody with colourblindness to determine, particularly with red-green colourblindness, the difference between something that's a good, go ahead, this is green, and something that's a big red, stop, think about what you're doing kind of message. Equally, with other kinds of colourblindness, you might find that people can't determine which ones are sort of information and which ones are more severe, if it's like between a yellow and a pinky or red, as my brother would find. So there's a whole bunch of different stuff around colour that is fascinating, but important to recognise when you're trying to design something that works for everyone. As well as that, people who are visually impaired might use a screen reader or similar to essentially dictate the content of a website to them, which for a lot of people is a really bizarre idea, the idea that you would read a website. But seeing it in action, it's actually fascinating, and it's incredibly complicated actually. When you see people using screen readers, they are genuinely incredible at it. So part of accessibility is really just optimizing the functionality of the systems that people are using anyway. If you're using a screen reader, you want a really nice experience, in the same way that if you're kind of the vast majority of your users come to your website, they want a really good user experience visually. You want to give somebody a really good dictated experience so that they can navigate quickly and efficiently, and they don't have to spend their whole time going around loops and wondering what's what. So with a screen reader, one thing that's really important is about making sure that it's really clear what the structure of a page is. So making sure that your headings are in the right places, making sure that you have descriptions on images that are important. One of the things that I've noticed most often is pictures of things like charts and tables, because it doesn't sound like a big deal, but when it comes down to it, if somebody visually impaired is trying to interact with that content, what do you get from an image? It's so one thing that you can really benefit from is using real charts embedded onto a page, which often have an accessibility function that will read those out in a sensible way, or having accompanying tables of data, because a screen reader will be able to read those out as it would any table. Yeah, so there's a lot that goes into accessibility, and it can sound like quite a daunting task, making something accessible, particularly if it already exists and it's an idea of going back in and changing everything and rewording and making things more accessible. But there's a few really small things that can be done to make a dramatic difference. And it doesn't matter if you're a developer and you're doing this kind of thing in your code and it's structuring HTML, or if you're somebody who works with content management systems, for instance, something like WordPress. You can apply most of these in both contexts. So really it's a nice way that everyone can engage and make the web a more accessible place, I guess. So the first one is headings. So headings when you see them visually, you don't think a lot about them. They just stand out, you know. And it's very clear what's a sub-level underneath something else, just from the size of the text and whether it's bold or not, or underlined, that kind of thing. You really can judge that. But with a screen reader or for a visually impaired user, that might not be so clear. So one thing that's important is to structure those headings in a logical order. So you should have one big top-level heading at the beginning of pages that explains what the page is for. And below that, a number of slightly smaller headings. In HTML, they'd be H2s. In something like a CMS, you'd probably have an obvious title and then heading 1, I think it would be called. And so you want those for the second most important bits of content. And then everything that goes below them, if you have another heading, it's the slightly smaller one. So in HTML, H3. And what that means is that when a visually impaired user uses these things, they can filter down to the kind of headings that matter, but also the way that the page is read out to them makes a lot more sense. It's very clear to them where the sections fall, what content fits in which context, and that just makes it overall a better experience. Yeah, so a second one is around images. So obviously images, everyone wants images on their websites. It's a way to make things attractive. It's a way to convey information, to display data, to show a certain vibe to a website, I guess. But obviously that doesn't get conveyed through, text to speech. So what you can do is provide alternative text on images, particularly if they're conveying something important to the brand or the message that you are giving. So you can see some really horrible ones of these that are just like a description of a picture, but you can use that to convey kind of a tagline, a brand, a concept, a narrative, but also to explain something important about collaboration or teamwork. If that's the content of the image, it's not necessarily about describing like word for word exactly what's in it, but describing why that's there. Because for a visually impaired user, you see an image, and if you don't know what it is about, I mean, you could be missing something huge. So as much as anything, it's about a reassurance that there's nothing significant there that's being missed. And I guess the final one is about back to colours. So if you're trying to highlight something as important, either as important because it's a really good thing that you want to tell somebody about, or if you're trying to warn somebody of a mistake they might be making or show them that they have made a mistake, be really conscious when you're using colours that everyone might not be able to see them the way that you can see them. And for some people that means they see no colour at all. If some people literally see in black and white, and so it's about the tones for them matter more. Equally, for people who have a kind of colourblindness that means that they confuse colours, that can make the messages you're giving them very confusing if you're trying to use just colour to convey a certain narrative. So one of the best things to do is to accompany colours with icons or with text to make it incredibly clear what's going on and what you're trying to tell somebody. So rather than just having a little red outline on something saying you've made a mistake, make sure to have text at the beginning of that form that says there's an error here, you need to fix these fields, that kind of thing. Because if it's half red and half green and somebody's got red-green colour blindness, are they going to know? Or are they going to have to go through every single one and guess? And it's about that, stopping people from having to guess and having a really horrible interaction, because you wouldn't want that if you were trying to pay for something or buy a service or just get to know something. It's about being kind to people, I guess. Yeah, and that one can go quite far. I mean, I'm a big fan of providing patterns on things like charts, because differentiating between the different colours on a pie chart, for instance, particularly when you've got a key to the one side, can be really difficult. Because if you see 3 of the 5 colours as kind of the same, it might take a lot of mental energy just to determine which one's which and what that means. And those kinds of pie charts and bar charts can be really significant, particularly in academic literature or anything to do with sales or performance on a website. And it's easy to overlook that. So one thing that can be really, really beneficial is providing patterns that are either permanently there, or if you like, that can be configured on or off. A lot of people who are colourblind are used to using a colourblind mode on games. Video games in particular are a great example of this one. But having a colourblind mode that allows people to configure something like patterns on charts can be really beneficial, because then they don't have to worry about what means what. It's obvious. So yeah, those are a few basics that you could apply to either code, HTML, or to something like a CMS or WordPress, to just try and make everything a bit more usable by everybody, not just your 90% of the users that you would generally be expecting to have.